Okay, everyone, welcome. Thank you for coming. I'm just going to go over some brief general things and then I will hand the reins over to Dr. Ramsland. Just a brief intro about myself. If you don't know me, my name is Sarah Ellsworth, and I'm the president of the Criminology and Criminal Justice Collective at the University of Michigan Dearborn. Dr. Ramsland is here to talk all about the field of forensic psychology. But just in case, if for whatever reason you guys are having technical difficulties, if you can't stay for the entire time, if whatever happens, I did just hit record. So we are recording this webinar and we are going to post it in the next couple of days. Additionally, if you have any questions throughout the panel, you should see on the bottom, there's a little Q&A feature. You can go ahead and just type them in there and I can kind of go ahead and mediate in between. But that's all I have. So Dr. Ramsland, you can go ahead, take it away.
Okay, hello, thank you for having me. And I'm going to talk a little bit about, in general, what people in forensic psychology do, but also what I do, because I've done a little bit different direction to my career. So I'll give you kind of an overview. All right, maybe I won't. This was working before everybody came. Let's see. There we go. All right, so I am not only a professor of forensic psychology, I'm also an assistant provost at my university, DeSales University, and I am the author of 70 books, many of which are about forensic science, forensic psychology, extreme offenders, serial killers, all kinds of stuff. So I'm going to talk about some of that as we go. I'm actually in our crime scene house, which I will mention a little bit later and show you a little bit more about that. We have a place where we can do labs, and I have the textbook you see in front of you is one that I wrote for this class. It's called Psychological Sleuthing, and I set up crime scenes for students to observe, talk about, brainstorm about, and try to figure out. My courses, I do an overview of, at the undergraduate level, I do an overview of forensic psychology. I do a course on extreme offenders, mass murderers, and serial killers. I do the course I just mentioned, Psychological Sleuthing, which is a psychology of death investigation. And at the graduate level in the criminal justice program, I do an advanced forensic psychology course and behavioral criminology. So that goes along with our investigative track. So what is forensic psychology? It's wherever psychology intersects with the legal system and the investigative system. So there are many, many different places where people who want to go into this field can focus their career. So I'll talk a bit about some of those. Assessment is one area. There's a lot of assessment that goes on, especially for the court system, in forensic hospitals, psychiatric hospitals, in prisons. So that's a very heavily clinical work. There's also consulting, which I do some of because I do consulting from some of the death investigation things that I do, as well as consulting about murderers, serial killers. There's research and teaching. Obviously, I'm doing both of those right now, and also prediction, or what's called threat assessment, which is a very difficult area of psychology, but there are some psychologists who do that. Most forensic psychologists are doing something with assessment. They are doing competency evaluations, that is, determining if somebody's present mental state is that they can participate in some legal proceeding, and that can be at any point, whether it's to waive their rights, competency to confess, competency to accept a search, competency to go to trial, competency to represent themselves or to take the stand, and even competency to be executed. There is such a thing. The MSO is the mental state at the time of the offense. So competency is present mental state. MSO is past mental state. And sometimes you can tell past mental state from present, but not always. So that's a particular area that psychologists and psychiatrists both get involved in for the courts. And then on the civil side, you might do something like emotional damage from things like harassment, sexual assault, child endangerment, things like that. So that's a very different form of forensic psychology, but it's one that does very well for people. Making recommendations is another area, and you would also be using assessment tools for this. So threat assessment would be something like dangerousness in a school system or a workplace, or trying to predict whether an offender who's about to go on parole might be in danger of recidivating or repeating what they've done. Making recommendations about sex offenders, because even when they've served their sentence, they might still be a threat. And then what do we do about something like that? So that's one of the areas of the professions. Specialized research, this is where you actually can be pretty creative. Usually you're doing research in something that will cross over between psychology and the criminal justice system. Eyewitness memory is a pretty big area. Memory itself, things like the notion of repressed memory that sometimes is put forward, and dissociative identity disorder. We have confessions that we have now found can be false, and people do admit to things they never did, and under certain circumstances, such as being young, being fatigued, low intelligence, having some kind of mental instability. There are all kinds of conditions that go into false confessions, and there are people who specialize specifically in that. Deception detection, another area. Cognitive processes, the cognitive errors that are part of our thinking process. Psychopathy is a huge area of research, not just being able to diagnose that somebody is a psychopath, but what to do about that in certain circumstances. There's a difference between criminal psychopaths and non-criminal psychopaths. People are doing all kinds of research on that, male versus female, kids at risk for becoming adult psychopaths, etc. There's a lot of people who look at sexual deviance, and their entire careers are just around all the different forms of sexual deviance, and especially how they cross over into criminal behavior. Subcultures, there can be all kinds of very odd things. That's why I say this is a really creative area. And you would specialize in understanding. I went undercover in the vampire subculture once and wrote a book about it. And that was really interesting. So now I'm a specialist in it, and sometimes people consult with me. And then certainly extreme offenders. I get a lot of calls for consulting on mass murderers and serial killers. The consulting area means that you have developed an expertise in something that would put your expertise in demand, and something like consulting on juries. So this would involve an attorney hiring you to come in and help them pick candidates for a jury, develop questionnaires for asking them, observing their behavior, predicting how they might make decisions. There's an entire industry around jury consulting. The correctional system also, prison design, groups in prison, assessments in prison. There's all kinds of things, parole. The isolation, what happens to people when they're put into, isolation for long periods of time. So, and what goes on with the prison system with mental disorders, because so many of our prisons are now holding tanks for the mentally ill. So that's an entire study in itself. And then death investigations, I'm going to say a little bit more about that because this is something I do consult on. So let me talk about some of that. I was on an exhumation team for a little while. I wrote a book about this with James Stars, who's featured here. He liked to dig up the deceased to find out what really happened to them. Like Jesse James was he really in his grave? That was a really interesting kind of thing to do. But also we had one that we see here where the the police said that he had committed suicide in his prison cell. And when we exhumed him, it turned out not to be a suicide at all. So that would be something that we would offer services for. That's completely freelance. There's no job like this. He paid for the exhumations. Most of us were volunteers on the team, but it was a really extraordinary experience. So as I got into death investigations, I began to learn a lot about something called psychological autopsies. And this is something that very few people have even heard of. But coroners and medical examiners, when they make a death determination, so there's a death incident and they're called to the scene, and sometimes the manner of death is obvious, but manner of death would be natural, accident, suicide, or homicide. So sometimes it's very easy to put them into one of those categories, but often they are ambiguous, and certain factors it's not so clear which manner of death they would go into. So it'd be labeled as undetermined or undetermined pending more investigation. And so someone who with knowledge about psychological autopsy methods would be doing a very elaborate investigation of the victimology, of learning about who the victim is. Are they likely to have been suicidal? Were they afraid of somebody? Do they have a history of mental illness or suicide attempts? Do they have suicides in their family, et cetera? So you would do this almost mini bio of the person to try to figure out what is the likelihood it would be suicide or homicide or accident. And that calls on an area of psychology that very few people know about called suicidology. And that is where you become an expert at all the things that go on with suicide. And I have been doing that. I've done a lot of study of suicide because that also makes you an expert on things like staged scenes. And we have staged suicides that are actually homicides. We have staged accidents or homicides that were actually suicides. We have accidents that are mistaken to be suicides. And we have suicides that don't get called correctly because police officers don't believe somebody would have killed themselves in that particular way. When you study suicide, you find out that people do some pretty astonishing things. And if you're the expert, you can be there to say, no, here's a case where someone stabbed himself 83 times, and that was a suicide. Or a person used a chainsaw. There's a lot of chainsaw suicides, but at any rate, you develop an expertise in this area. So then, again, this is a freelance kind of career where you get to know coroners and medical examiners in your area. And when they realize you have this expertise, they might call you in on a case. I've done quite a few cases with my local coroner. And then criminal profiling, that's part of one of the classes I teach, psychological sleuthing. So first I set up the whole thing with psychological autopsies, and then I talk about criminal profiling. I have co-authored a few books with FBI agents who formerly were in the profiling unit. So got a sense of how they work their cases. And profiling is basically a way to narrow down leads so that you minimize your potential pool of suspects. Profiling is not there, contrary to Criminal Minds and shows like that. They're not there to solve the crimes, arrest anybody, or anything like that. They're there to, as consultants with experience in many more cases than most officers in local jurisdictions have, to help with what's the type of person who would do this? What's the likelihood of our pool of suspects being this kind of person versus that kind of person? What about team killers? What about more people than just one being involved in this? So criminal profiling is its own kind of career, You don't have to be in the FBI to do this, though they're obviously the most famously associated with profiling. But lots of psychologists who become consultants to police departments or who know investigators may do criminal profiling too. It's got its start with a surgeon, and then a magistrate, and then a pathologist, all of that well before the FBI ever began doing profiling. So you learn how to do what goes on in a death investigation, how to analyze behavior, how to read people, and you can develop an expertise that would then make you into a potential consultant. And then as you do well with that, they'll call on you again. This is our crime scene house. This is just on the edge of our campus. Again, it's DeSales University in Pennsylvania. And we happen to have this vacant property, so we asked if we could use this to lay out scenes for students to solve. There are a few other universities that have places like this, but ours actually was one of the first that devoted an entire house to this. So when I'm doing a scene, for example, like this one, which is based on an actual crime, a double homicide. So first I try to lay it all out with a diagram, and then I have to think about what is it I want the students to get out of this. So one of the things is about observation, because this really is a staged homicide, double homicide, and it's staged to look like the guy that's lying in the middle of the floor there was trying to kill the woman, and her husband saved the day by killing him, but then he didn't save his wife. And so he's very distraught, etc. But it turns out he actually set up the guy to come over, and then he killed him. When his wife came running in, he killed her, and then, called and made it look like that he was the victim, when in fact he was a double murderer. But what they need to do is, in this scene, see some of the items that would suggest that the story the guy told doesn't jive with things in the scene. And they have to be very observant to be able to figure that out. So when I lay it out, then we have these mannequins, and we all have all kinds of crime scene kits and whatnot. So I laid it out like this, and then around the house are the various other clues that they need to pay attention to, but this is obviously the main scene. And just beyond where you see the stairs is a classroom. So you could use the classroom to do some of the teaching of this, but the rest of the house is like a regular house. And then the students come in and have a look. They might come in on their own. They're in teams, because they're going to have to brainstorm this, because they've been learning throughout the whole semester how to do teamwork. And so they'll come in, they'll look, they'll take pictures, they'll document everything, and then they'll talk to one another, and then they have to deliver a report in terms of what do you see that's not consistent or that is consistent. Is the husband's story something you would support? And in this scene, if they're very vigilant, they'll see that the blood spatter doesn't work with the timing of the story he told. Also, there's a note that this is the address in the victim's pocket, that this is the address he should be at 4:30. So what guy is planning that kind of a murder and he's got a note about it in his pocket? There were items in his car parked outside, so they have to actually go outside and see some things. There's items in his car that make it questionable that this guy is coming there for murder. This family has a guard dog, but the guard dog is locked in the garage. So if they have a guard dog locked in the garage, how scared are they? So there's all kinds. It's very elaborate. Another room, there's a note. Another room, there's a baby, because they just adopted a baby. So they have to go through the whole house and document these items. And that builds up their ability to see, when we go over it, they see what they missed, which is about them learning how important it is to observe small clues and, interpret them in terms of the reconstruction of a scene. But for me, a lot of this is my authorship. And back when I first started all this, I went to the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Actually, I was a philosophy professor at Rutgers University. That's before I ever did any of this. And I decided to quit after 15 years and go back to school at John Jay College of Criminal Justice to get a master's degree in forensic psychology, because I was writing for the Court TV website and I wanted to just beef up what I knew about crime and all that. So through all that, I ended up being able to write this book just as CSI was beginning as a show. And I was asked by an editor, can you write a book like this in 3 months? And I said, yes. I always say yes, and then find out how to do it. And so the forensic science of CSI was the first one, the CSI effect, the science of cold case files, et cetera, et cetera. A Voice for the Dead was the one I wrote when I did the exhumation team. So that was, like a couple of years experience being the documentarian of his cases. Again, an amazing opportunity. But also I co-wrote some other books with FBI profilers. Here's the one on spree killers, where we were the first to document or to categorize spree killers and document them in many, many countries. We have the largest database of spree killers in the world in this book. I wrote a book with Greg McCrary, a former FBI profiler, and with Henry Lee on some of his cases. So all of this comes together for me as a professor and a researcher to be able to present not just what I know about some of these investigations, but what some of these other people know, because then because they're my co-authors, I would have them come and speak at my university and to my students. So they got that. And my expertise, thanks to multiple articles on the Court TV website, it was called the Crime Library. I then developed this expertise on extreme offenders. The Mind of a Murderer is a textbook that I use for my extreme offenders course, because it has a dozen cases of forensic psychologists who spent extra time with an extreme offender across the past century. So the first person who began talking to offenders to get their story in detail was at the end of the 19th century. And he kind of laid out the prototype of how to do this. So I mapped out other people they're all mental health experts. They spent time with someone like Ted Bundy or John Wayne Gacy or, some of these other offenders. And so I documented that all in this book. And then later I wrote this one that came out in 2020, was 30 cases of how various serial killers were caught. Sometimes their mistakes, sometimes forensic innovations, sometimes witness reports. In some cases, they turn themselves in. But in my class, we go over the psychological analysis of these cases. What's the developmental trajectory of, let's say, an 11-year-old who murders her whole family? Who is that? How'd she do it? Or Ted Bundy, as opposed to someone like Charles Starkweather, who was a spree killer. How are they different from one another? How did they develop? What were their trigger points in their life story? And that became something I just wanted to do, but it ended up becoming the thing that I really needed to have for something I ended up doing a little bit later. But the expertise came as a result of just doing one case after another. So the female serial killers, many of those. In fact, I was just consulted about an hour ago on female poisoners who are serial killers, because that's the kind of expertise I have developed. And then once we go through them, we also have the male killers. And I go through a number of different types from, our youngest is 8 years old. We have actually 2 serial killers who are 8 years old, up to the oldest. I spent a lot of time on Jack the Ripper, in terms of who is Jack the Ripper. We have many suspects, but I also then, look at who is and who isn't a serial killer. So I use this chart because there are notions like you can tell by the look in their eye. And I say, really, can you, because some people on this chart are not serial killers, can you really tell the difference? And you really can't. And so that's a silly idea. I go through a lot of the myths about serial killers. Some of them came from the early FBI studies that were based on unrepresentative, extremely small samples of incarcerated white male serial killers. So you can see that, that those formulas just don't apply. And that became very important for this study that I ended up doing. So all of this kind of converged when I became the person who worked with the BTK killer, Dennis Rader, on his life story. We spent 5 years on this, and a lot of that came from, I already had the prototypes from the mind of a murderer, and all my expertise came to bear on being able to do this. So let me tell you a little bit about him, and then we'll get back to the book. In 1974, right around the time Ted Bundy also began, we had a murder of 4 people in a house, the Otero family. And it just was out of the blue. It was in Wichita, Kansas, in the middle of winter. And these people were smothered and tied up, and the 11-year-old girl was hanged from a beam in the basement. And they had no clues at all as to who might have done this. 3 of the children who had been at school came home and found them. And there was an idea that maybe organized crime had been part of this. But at any rate, Rader then continued to kill until 1991. So he got away with this for actually 31 years. He continued to kill until 1991, and he killed 10 people, mostly women. But around the area, the general area of Wichita, Kansas, 2 of them were very close to his own home up in the north there, but the rest were in Wichita proper. And they could not figure out who it was. They didn't know. In fact, they only thought there were 7 of them related. They did not know some of the ones from 1985, 86, and 91 were actually crimes from BTK because he didn't communicate. Whereas with the earlier ones, he had communicated and talked about being a serial killer and wanting media attention like Bundy was getting, and some of the other elite serial killers. He wanted to be among them. And then he went quiet until 2004, when an attorney decided to write a book about the 7 unsolved BTK killings. And he did not like the idea that, first of all, they got the number wrong, but secondly, he just didn't want someone else writing his story because he wanted to keep control. So he reemerged with Bill Thomas Killman, BTK, with a fake address, and he started sending these Barbie dolls dressed as the victims. Like I just told you, one of them was hanged from a drain pipe in the basement. There is the doll to represent her. And in some cases, he sent some of the items he had taken off the victims to prove that BTK was back. BTK was looking for the next victim. He wanted to re-terrorize Wichita. And he was having a pretty good time with he stuffed this into cereal boxes because he thought that was a pretty good joke. And he kept, giving chapters of his story basically to the press because he wanted to read about it. And he was having a pretty good time. And he finally told law enforcement that he didn't have the time to be copying all this stuff, because what he'd do is go from one copier to another and copying the copies. So he asked them if he could send a disc. And they thought, are you kidding? Okay, whatever. And he told them to put in the paper that it was safe for him to do so and that they would continue the cat and mouse game with him. And they're like, okay. And he sent the disc, and they were able to use this disc to find that it had been written in a church by someone named Dennis. And so basically that was how they arrested him. He made that kind of an error. And he asked them, the first question he put to them was, why did you lie to me? They said, because we were trying to catch you. And they did. And so that was 2005. And 2010, I had seen a woman on Facebook who said she had tried writing this book with Rader. She had spent 5 years corresponding with him, and apparently didn't want to write it because when I contacted her and said, whatever happened to your book with Dennis Rader, she asked me to take it over. I had no idea it was going to end up taking me 5 years because there was a lot of legal entanglement with the victims' families because they were going to get the proceeds of it, which was fine with me. I just saw this as an opportunity. And like I said, with the mind of a murderer, that was my prototype. I had a bunch of good role models from mental health professionals who had spent a lot of time with an extreme offender to learn their story. So I had my role models. Here is my opportunity to do exactly the same thing. So this is a pretty unique opportunity to explore who Dennis Rader was in terms of being able to present himself as a family man, because he was married and had 2 kids. He was the president of his church body, a very active member of his church. He had a full-time job and a member of his community, a contributing member of his community. So all of the facade of a normal individual, ordinary, not that bright, had a dog, had a garden, had a tree house, and he's also a murderer, his secret life. So how did he manage this secret life as a stalker, a person who broke into houses and stole things, which he also did, and a murderer, and also attempted murderer, because he attempted a couple times and failed. So who is this person who's able to do this, who's able to present such a normal face to the world for 30 years while he's killing people? That was what we explored. He was great about reading things, thinking through things, writing down the details. I mean, the book is about, I'd say 85% his voice, from letters, from many, many phone calls. There were some prison visits, but they turned out not to be very good for actually doing any work. They were mostly just so he could meet me and talk to me. Most of what we did was through letters and phone calls. And we had a lot of different ways into this because he wanted to work in codes, which is fine. It was interesting behavior, unusual, but I wanted to work with him. And I already mentioned this idea that there were all these formulas out there about serial killers based on unrepresentative samples that the FBI collected. And I wanted to work with Rader because he presented an outlier. He had a normal childhood, intact family, both sets of grandparents, raised on a farm, oldest of 4 brothers, not a troublemaker. None of the things we come to believe about serial killers were true of this man, but he was a serial killer. And I wanted to understand that and make a contribution to the literature on serial murder at the same time. So I call it a guided autobiography because I'm guiding him toward talking and thinking about his approach to murder and his response to murder in a way that will benefit us. So it's not just some serial killer, blah, blah, blah. We've got plenty of that out there. It had to be structured in a way that was going to benefit law enforcement, criminal justice, and forensic psychology. I think I achieved that. So I was happy with that. And that then became a 4-part A&E documentary that I was an executive producer on. It was a lot of work, a lot of work, but I was very pleased with it. In fact, it made him cry, which I thought was quite an accomplishment to make a serial killer cry, but we did it. So that is out there. And my current work is with another serial killer who was an accomplice. Elmer Wayne Henley was an accomplice to Dean Corll, the Candyman, in the 1970s in Houston, Texas. He murdered 27 boys, buried 17 of them in a boat shed, and 6 on a beach and 4 at a lakefront. And when Wayne met him, he was 15 years old and leveraged into becoming an accomplice. And so by the time he's 17, he's killed 9 or 10 people, and he had wanted to be a minister. So how does a person who wanted to be a minister end up becoming a serial killer? And there were 2 accomplices for Dean Corll, one of whom had no problem doing it. It was fine with him, but Wayne suffered. And in the end, he's the only serial killer accomplice who killed the serial killer. So he killed his mentor and to stop it all, and then led police to where all the bodies were buried. But, for that, he got life in prison, which is where he currently is. He's been speaking with me over the past year. We will have a book about this as well. And he's very intelligent. Has thought a lot about his crimes. How did he get to that place? But we really have a lot of work now on the teenage brain, and how he could have been vulnerable to this. And so he's learning a lot too in terms of some of the research that we're able to bring to him. But that's my current project. But with that, I'm also writing a set of novels that feature a forensic psychologist, Annie Hunter, my alter ego, I have to say. This is the first of the series, Ice Cream Man, that came out last September, and I just finished the second one. And she is a forensic psychologist who runs an investigation agency. So now I can bring all the things, and she's a suicidologist, so she does psychological autopsies and does consulting and death investigation and all of that, but she can also do assessments in the prisons. And so this novel is set in the a private juvenile detention facility where kids are getting trafficked. And so all with a hurricane. So have to have all these elements. And I had a blast. I'm loving writing fiction, but I'm using real cases and real experiences to set it all up, which is what makes it really, I think, interesting for me, because the kinds of things she sees are things that are actually out there. And so that's my character. Also, I'm an executive producer for this show, Murder House Flip. This came out of my Dangerous Minds class. I was teaching about a couple of brothers and their cousin who murdered the rest of the family and took off. And I was talking about them as juvenile offenders when one of my students came and said, their house is for sale. And immediately I just went, okay, HGTV meets CSI. And I proposed this to my friends in Hollywood, and it became a show, Murder House Flip. There are 2 seasons. If you have a Roku account or device, you can see this for free. Just go search for Murder House Flip. And the very first house we did, well, this is the house of the triple homicide that inspired the show. You can see the for sale sign there. The very first house we did was a female serial killer who would bring in, men with their welfare checks and whatnot. And she was this little old lady who was taking care of them and cooking for them and bringing them tea and whatnot, and then killing them. And you see there were 7 bodies in the yard. When they finally stopped her, she did try to escape. They got her, and her name was Dorothy Puente. So we went to the owners of this house because we really wanted to do what the idea of this show is you heal the murder space. So we didn't really flip the houses. It was really a murder house makeover, but we're only healing the murder space and then returning the house to them, refreshed. And they did not want to change anything about the house because of the notoriety. They thought was kind of cool that she had killed these men up on the second floor and dragged their bodies down, to cut them up and put them in the yard. So I said, well, I bet you want to have a new yard. And they did. So this became our first house in Murder House Flip. And it became such a fun and interesting show. So you see, sometimes you get your expertise and it pays off in all kinds of ways you did not expect. So back to the beginning, forensic psychology. You can do research and writing, as I do, which led to teaching because I was able to set up the forensic psychology program at DeSales University. They had nothing until I came. I also set up the online masters in criminal justice and the minors in forensic biology and forensic chemistry. They had no forensics before I came, and now they have a thriving program. Consulting and investigating, as I just said, and writing fiction, because why not? I'm very happy to be able to be doing that. How do you prepare to go into a career like this? Obviously, college is the first thing. You do not have to major in forensic psychology in college to go on in this field. If you have a program near you that does have that, like ours at DeSales, John Jay College of Criminal Justice has an undergraduate, but you don't need that. Just psychology is good enough. And a lot of clinical psychology, if you can get it. You then go on to graduate school. Typically, people will get a master's degree first. And the best program is John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Marymount is another good one. Nova Southeastern in Florida is another good one. They pop up, but you have to be careful because of the popularity of the subject has sometimes made these programs pop up that really aren't very good. They're not taught by people who have any experience out there. They just teach out of a textbook. So you want to be careful to be working with people who are genuinely doing research or working on the kind of thing that interests you. Internships, that is a real important part of this, because you will then just pretty much figure out, is this what you want to do? You get some work experience. Maybe it's not all you thought it was going to be. It's just not what you want to do. Great. Go do something else. Or your internship could network you right into a job. That's another possibility. And I have watched a number of students, and my students, go through their internship into a career. Do some research projects. Even if you aren't in a structured, formal environment, like a undergraduate program, do some research projects that will show you, turn them into writing projects. Try to get something published. It will show you where your interests lie, whether you really are interested in doing some of these things or not. Get a mentor if you can. Don't ask me, I'm about to retire, but get a mentor if you can. So you look around to see who's writing what, who's researching what. Eyewitness memory, that would be Elizabeth Loftus or Gary Wells. They're doing amazing work in that field. So find them and try to get into the schools where they're teaching, or find out more about them. Like when I wrote The Mind of a Murderer, they became my mentors for being able to go ahead and do the projects with Dennis Rader and Wayne Henley. And lots of interest groups on social media for forensic psychology. Sometimes they devolve into, true crime, speculative, tabloidy stuff. But if you get into one where there are professionals speaking back and forth, you're definitely going to get a sense of, first of all, how to network, and also the kinds of things that interest professionals in this field. So that is basically how you prepare. And at this point, I'll be happy to take questions.
All right, so I got a couple questions already. One of them is just kind of like, what does your day-to-day look like as a forensic psychologist?
Well, I really think of myself more as a professor of forensic psychology, because when you think forensic psychologist, that's usually a licensed clinical psychologist with a private practice, which I don't have. I once had a private practice, but it was not for me. I really prefer forensic investigation and death investigation. Day to day, I have my duties at the university because I'm assistant provost and also a professor. So whenever I'm not doing those things, I am researching and writing. I always have deadlines. I have 2 books going right now. I have several Hollywood projects going. So I'm constantly working on the professional side while I'm also keeping the job alive. But once I finally retire from teaching, I plan to do a lot more research and writing. So you'll see me at the computer for the most part all the time.
And then I know you mentioned internship opportunities, but is there any specific types of internships or experience that people interested in forensic psychology should look for specifically?
Yeah, internships are generally at the master's level, and most, at least the master's programs I'm familiar with, will require them anyway. At the undergraduate level, you can do things like work in group homes. Maybe you can get some work at a juvenile facility. You might be able to get into like a place that does assessments, and then you don't actually get to do the assessments as an undergraduate, but you can learn about them and do some of the, grunt work, basically. Most internships want you to be at the master's level because you're handling human beings and highly sensitive material, and sometimes very unstable people, and sometimes dangerous people. So they really want that to be at the at least the master's level. And those internships can be at prisons. They can be at forensic psychiatric facilities. They can be in testing centers. We have a victims council here as well. So sometimes people can do internships there where they learn how to run a homicide, like a murder survivors group, for example, or a sexual assault, where you take someone to court. You might get an internship kind of on the criminal justice side, with judges and attorneys or law enforcement. Some of our forensic psychology students do that.
Gotcha. We had a question pop in just now. What's something unique that you learned that surprised you the most in just generally the field of forensics?
I wonder why people always think I'd be surprised. There's not much that surprises me. I do this stuff every day. Every day, I see the worst things people do to each other and to themselves. Like, I guess I was surprised when I saw a case the other day of a guy who stabbed himself 19 times in the throat, walked for a quarter of a mile, and got on his phone, and he's still, it's on video. We know he did it. That surprised me. That was amazing. Sometimes if you're talking to a serial killer, for example, and they might say something you're not expecting, like Wayne Henley. We went through a whole year talking about, and sometimes 3-4 hours a day, talking about his experiences. And when it was all said and done, essentially, he then said, he made me wear the victim's clothing. Like, okay, that's a very different dimension that you neglected to say. And he said, I've never told anybody that, ever. So that was kind of surprising, in that he would decide this big secret to go ahead and let's put it out there. But in terms of what people think of to do, nothing surprises me. And I was asked that very question by an attorney yesterday, because we were working on a case and they wanted to know what about this particular person would surprise you to learn. I said, nothing, because the most perfectly normal seeming person can have very dark secrets and really deviant, perverse practices that they are hiding from people. I've seen that over and over and over. So nothing surprises me, really.
Gotcha. I know you mentioned as far as like going to college, majoring in psychology is genuinely like all you need. And then typically master's comes after. So what would you suggest as far as like what people should get their master's in and what people should get their doctorate in if they're hoping to pursue forensic psychology?
Well, you can just go pure forensics. That there's a few schools that will do that. Certainly, I would suggest getting at least a master's in with the forensic background. However, getting a doctorate in forensic psychology will not put you further ahead than getting a doctorate in clinical psychology, because clinical psychology is the backbone of most forensic psychology practices. You will need to set up a private practice of some kind or work in a clinic of some kind if you want to network with the courts and be available for assessment, competency, mental state, etc. Or you'll need to be working in a prison in some capacity. There are very few states at this point, and actually I think Michigan's one of them, come to think of it, that let you call yourself a psychologist if you're only master's level. But I believe, I'm not sure about this, it used to be the case that Michigan was one, that they would let people working in a prison system at a master's level call themselves psychologists, but that could have changed. I remember looking at that one point and going, whoa, that's surprising. But you should always pay attention. And even if you think you're going to stay in one state, you might not. And so you're going to have to make sure you know what are the requirements of another state. So I would say clinical psychology at the doctor, either a PsyD or a PhD, will serve you well going into this field. I think those are the two. Like, I don't think cognitive psychology will do well for you, even though that's a great thing to study for understanding how the mind works and all that. It's not the same as clinical or forensic psychology. So you have a couple of options. I would say either one of those would suit you.
And then I just have two more questions, unless more come through, just to kind of end on. So I have, what was the highlight of your career, or what is the highlight of your career, and what is one of the biggest lessons you've learned throughout your career?
Well, I'd have to say the highlights were certainly working with serial killers, working closely, getting to know them very well. I made contributions with, and they're not the only two I've spoken to, they're just the only, Wayne and Dennis are the two I worked most intensely with. But I've spoken to others, and there's one in Michigan I've actually been talking to for about 25 years. Because I grew up in Michigan, so I know the terrain there. I think my work on extreme offenders, whether it's the serial killers, the spree killer book, where we categorize spree killers in a way no one else had ever done, those would be the highlights. But boy, I tell you right now, I'm loving the fiction and the being an executive producer of shows is a lot of fun. I've been a consultant for CSI, Bones, and a couple other, The Alienist, a couple other shows. That's always fun. So what was the second question? I don't remember what the second question was.
What's the biggest lessons that you've learned throughout your career?
Oh, my motto is, it's better to be told no than to lose an opportunity you might get if you ask. Because so much of my career has been serendipity. An opportunity comes, like a editor says, can you write this book in 3 months? Yes, I can. Changed my life. I say move forward, take a shot, take a risk, and risk being told no, risk being blocked, go for it, because if you hold back, because you feel intimidated or you think they're going to say no, you definitely aren't going to get the opportunity. I say better to be told no than to lose that opportunity. I've written Anne Rice's biography, Dean Koontz's biography. These are best-selling writers. And I was told, don't even bother asking them. They'll say no. They didn't. I wrote them. I wrote 7 books with Anne Rice and had a great experience. So I think you figure out what you want to do and you move into the opportunities that present themselves. That would be my career advice.
All right. And there's one more question that just came through. What would be the difference between a PsyD and a PhD in clinical psychology?
A PsyD is more of a applied experience, more practical, work-oriented. The PhD is typically more research-oriented. You do the big dissertation and make your contribution that way. A PsyD usually doesn't require the more intellectual kinds of stuff. I mean, they're both rigorous programs, but one is more applied than the other one.
Is there one that you would consider more beneficial if you're attempting to go into forensic psychology?
I always think clinical because I just know so many, the PhD, because I think it's easier to get a license and still probably commands maybe a little more respect, but there's no problem with going with the PsyD. You can get your license through that too. I just, maybe it's my own bias from being in this for so many years, but I guess if someone asked me which one to go for, I would go for the PhD.
All right, well, that's all the questions that came through. If there's any more, I will make sure to email them to you if you'd like me to. But other than that, thank you so much for coming. We appreciate it beyond belief. And like I said, I'm gonna make sure to post this recording at some point. So if any of you missed any part of it, you can go ahead and grab it later. But that's everything for tonight. Again, thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate it.